June 1812. On the banks of the Neman River, the largest army Europe had ever assembled stood ready to cross into Russian territory. 685,000 men, Frenchmen, Germans, Poles, Italians, Austrians, an empire's worth of soldiers united under one flag, one ambition, one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. He called it the Grande Armée, and on paper, it was unstoppable. Napoleon believed this would be quick. A decisive battle, a Russian surrender, and Tsar Alexander I would be forced back into the Continental System. The economic blockade meant to strangle Britain. He expected weeks, maybe 2 months at most. He did not expect Russia to simply disappear. As the French crossed the Neman on June 24th, they found no army waiting to fight them. The Russian forces, vastly outnumbered, refused battle. They retreated and retreated, drawing Napoleon deeper into a country the size of a continent, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point before a single major battle had even been fought. The land itself became the enemy. Roads turned to mud. Wells were poisoned or destroyed by retreating Cossacks. Villages were burned before the French could reach them. Within the first month, disease and desertion had already claimed tens of thousands of men, and they hadn't fired a shot. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, his army had shrunk by nearly a third. Not from combat, from attrition. September 7, 1812. Outside the village of Borodino, roughly 70 miles from Moscow, the Russians finally turned to fight. What followed was the single bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. Over 250,000 men clashed across open fields. French and Russian artillery pounded each other at close range for hours. Waves of infantry charged into cannon fire. Cavalry crashed into cavalry. By nightfall, an estimated 70,000 men lay dead or wounded, roughly one soldier for every 4 seconds of daylight the battle lasted. Neither side achieved a clear victory. The Russians withdrew in good order, having bled Napoleon's army badly without breaking it. Napoleon technically held the field, but he had lost tens of thousands of his most experienced soldiers for a battle that solved nothing. 1 week later, Napoleon's forces entered Moscow. He expected the Tsar to sue for peace now that the ancient capital had fallen. Instead, he found the city empty. Russian governor Fyodor Rostopchin had ordered it evacuated and set ablaze. Fires consumed most of Moscow over the following days. Napoleon sat in the Kremlin, watching his prize burn to ash around him, waiting for a peace offer that would never come. Alexander I refused to negotiate. Weeks passed. October arrived. And still, silence from St. Petersburg. Napoleon had won every battle and captured the enemy capital, and somehow he had already lost the war. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon gave the order no conqueror wants to give: retreat. It was already too late to leave by an untouched southern route. A Russian force blocked the way at Maloyaroslavets, forcing the Grande Armée back onto the same road they'd used coming in. A road already stripped bare of food, shelter, and forage. Then came the cold. Temperatures plummeted to levels the French, Italians, and Poles had never experienced. Historical accounts describe thermometers reaching -30, even -40 degrees Celsius by November and December. Men froze standing upright in formation. Horses dropped dead by the thousands, their frozen bodies stripped of meat by starving soldiers within minutes. Discipline collapsed. What had been one of history's most organized fighting forces became a starving, frost-bitten mob stretched across hundreds of miles of frozen road. Soldiers burned their own weapons for warmth. Men who fell behind were left where they dropped. There was no strength left to bury the dead or even to care. Cossack cavalry harassed the retreating columns constantly, picking off stragglers, ambushing supply wagons, turning every mile of the retreat into a fresh massacre. Late November 1812. The remnants of the Grande Armée reached the Berezina River and found the bridges destroyed, Russian forces closing in from multiple directions. What followed was one of the most desperate engineering feats and human tragedies of the entire campaign. French military engineers, working in freezing water up to their chests, built makeshift pontoon bridges under fire. Many of these engineers died from hypothermia within days, having sacrificed themselves so the army could cross. Tens of thousands of soldiers and camp followers pushed toward the narrow bridges as Russian artillery shelled the crossing point. Panic broke out. People were trampled. Bridges collapsed under the weight of the crowd, throwing hundreds into the freezing river. Historians estimate that between 20,000 and 40,000 people, soldiers, camp followers, wounded, died at the Berezina alone, either from combat, drowning, or exposure. The word Berezina entered the French language itself as a synonym for catastrophe. Napoleon abandoned his army entirely in early December, rushing back to Paris to secure his political position after word reached him of a coup attempt back home. He left Marshal Joachim Murat in command of what remained, a force now reduced to a fraction of its original size, marching through a Russian winter with almost no food, no shelter, and no discipline left to speak of. By the time the survivors stumbled back across the Neman River in December 1812, the same river they'd crossed with such confidence 6 months earlier, the numbers told a story almost too grim to comprehend. Of the roughly 685,000 men who had entered Russia that summer, historians estimate only around 40,000 to 70,000 returned as an organized fighting force. Some individual stragglers trickled back over following weeks, and a portion of troops from flanking corps survived by peeling off early. But the central force Napoleon personally led into Moscow and back was almost completely annihilated. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that somewhere between 400,000 and 570,000 men died during the campaign, from combat, starvation, disease, and the brutal cold. Hundreds of thousands more were captured or permanently disabled. It remains one of the most catastrophic military disasters in human history. The psychological and political shockwaves were immediate. Napoleon's aura of invincibility, built over 15 years of nearly unbroken victory, shattered in the snow of the Russian steppe. Prussia and Austria, previously forced allies, began turning against him. The coalition that would eventually defeat him at Leipzig in 1813 and finally at Waterloo in 1815 drew direct confidence from what happened in Russia. Napoleon himself later remarked that it was not the Russian army that defeated him, it was General Winter. But that framing conveniently ignores his own failures, underestimating the scale of the country, overextending his supply lines, and refusing to retreat from Moscow while there was still time. The Russian campaign of 1812 remains a brutal lesson in the limits of military ambition, a warning still studied by generals and historians alike over 2 centuries later.